Well, hello, everybody. My name is Mark Stencel. I am from the Reporters Lab at Duke University. I know you haven't seen enough of us today at Duke. We do love fact checking almost as much as we love our tchotchkes and swag. And um, we're here to talk today about manipulated and misleading images and how we might label them. This came up in the last session with my colleagues Bill and Joel. And really, if you think about it, the only thing that's as old as lying might be misleading images. So if you think about all those pictures of, say, the moon and the sun orbiting the Earth way back when, we're still apparently susceptible to this kind of misleading imagery. It makes a big impression. It has an impact on us. It has an impact on society. We have a great panel of folks here to talk with us about that subject, and I'm going to introduce you to them one by one, and then we'll get into a bit of a discussion. But just as a quick roundup, you're going to hear from Maarten Schenk from Leadstories, Claire Wardle from First Draft, Sam Gregory from Witness, and David Clinch from Storyful. So a really fabulous group, and I want to start by introducing you to Maarten Schenk, who's the co-founder of Leadstories.
Hi,
Maarten. I'm just impressed that you've been willing to leave Trendalizer for an hour to talk with us. I really appreciate that. I know that you tend to be sort of on there 24 hours, conquering the world. You recently changed how you all present images on Leadstories, and we'll come back to how you've done that and what you've done. But I'm curious. What made you take on that challenge? Why did you all want to change the way you'd been labeling images?
Well, we noticed that most people only saw our fact checks on social media, so on Facebook and on Twitter. And there's a headline and an image, and we were not doing anything with that image. So 90% of the space was wasted. And so we wanted to make the most of it and put as much information in there as we could.
And did you find that there were people were not understanding what they were seeing, or did you have concerns about that as well?
We just wanted the information to stand out better. If you post a link in the comments on Facebook and it has hoax or false in big red letters, that stands out, that draws attention in a discussion. Like, oh, somebody did the research on it and found a fact check and posted it. And that works better than just posting an obscure link to some website that doesn't give you an eye-catching image.
Great. Well, thanks, Maarten. We'll be back to you in just a moment. And Claire Wardle, who I think is in a secure, undisclosed location, avoiding trolls and various purveyors of misleading information. Claire, are you with us? There you are. Hope you're safe and sound.
I am.
Excellent. So what we're wondering, so you have partnered up First Draft with Partnership on AI and have just produced a terrific report on the principles of presenting misleading information. One of the things you all started by talking about was the harms that mislabeled or poorly labeled information can have. Can you describe those harms for us a little bit?
I think the biggest problem we have is that we have so little research about what these labels do, how audiences understand them. And those of us who were designing labels, we come from a very particular perspective, and we tend to trust our gut and be like, oh, people more want complexity, or they want to be story, they want an exclamation mark. But ultimately, we don't actually know how different types of audiences in different contexts around different formats and different types of messages make sense of these labels. And as we've seen, particularly in the US, well, recently the platforms are moving into this space, but the research that we have, and that's what we outlined in the report, is great. But a lot of that has been done in American universities with American undergraduates in laboratory settings. Actually, what we need to do is to say, Maarten's doing great work, but how are we rigorously testing what those changes that Maarten has made, what's that doing to audiences? The Twitter new manipulated media labels, how are people responding to that? So we came up with this 12 principles, but I'll be honest, that's based on the research that we have. So it's kind of best practices based on what we have, but really it's very, very limited in terms of what the ways that we're now rolling out these labels. And I fear that in 3 years' time, we're going to be like, oops, we didn't realize that when we do that, this happens. And so my big call to arms is just to say, how can we work more closely with the platforms? How can we work with researchers and fact checkers to be doing this rigorous research in real time and get that publication out quickly enough so that practitioners can change what they're doing, or not? Maybe we're doing everything perfectly, but we just don't know.
We really share that exact same concern, Claire, because the research we've done at the Reporters Lab, where we've tried to go out and do sort of industry style focus groups and such, because that academic research is fascinating, but also sort of the laboratory situation is just odd, and it sort of distorts the experience of what you feel real time. You just kind of know that in our guts, although I guess we should test that as well. So we'll come back and ask you to describe the principles in just a minute, but let me introduce also Sam Gregory from Witness. Sam, thanks for joining us today too. We were just talking with Claire about these harms. They're also the sort of harms to the world around us that these images create, and that's something you have sort of a lot of firsthand experience with. What just to sort of give us the context of why any of this really matters to the world. What kind of harms should we be concerned about?
Yeah, I think this is, again, and it's a conversation I've been hearing here at Global Fact, is, what are the goals of our fact-checking or our verification work? And where we're coming from at Witness is this question of how do we look at community-based harm reduction? And the context of that is looking at the range of ways in which misleading or false information, misinformation and disinformation leads directly to harms at a community level and direct violence. And so the examples of that are, of course, well known to us. Myanmar across the past 5 or 6 years, and even in the last couple of days, we've seen a couple of incidents where Muslim people have been targeted, incited by online content. But we could also look more recently, frankly, at the US protest movements, where you've seen misleading information leading to hundreds of people gathering with weapons in small towns in Oregon, believing that there are armed Black Lives Matters protesters coming. So where that takes us in the labeling discussion is how do we think about how are labels helping when we look at this broader question of how do we mitigate harm? How do we think about reducing harm? What are the tools that are needed, both at a professional level but at a community level, and what kind of signals do labels give for that? So that's one level of what we're grappling with at Witness is that question. And then the second question is, how do we do that as we see an advancing array of technological innovations in this space? And so at Witness, we're both concerned about existing problems of direct harm created by mis and disinformation, but also the emerging way in which we communicate around new forms of mis and disinformation like deepfakes, but also the potential benefits and risks of new forms of infrastructure to combat those, what we term authenticity infrastructure. So I'm looking forward to talking also about how we think about those questions of new technical tools for fact checkers, and how those are communicated to publics, these questions of how you track the manipulations of media and the authenticity of media.
Thanks so much, Sam. And of course, the way that so many people are getting these images, the way that it's showing up on the screens in front of us is through the platforms. And that's why I want to talk to David for a moment here. So let me introduce David Clinch from Storyful. You have, through Storyful, talked with a lot of the platforms that we've been talking about over the past couple of days, probably the past several years. What kind of guidance have you given them on how to deal with these kinds of issues?
Well, that is an excellent question, Mark. We're 10 years into Storyful now since our founding, and our first 2 clients were, news organizations and YouTube. So we've been sandwiched, you might even say squeezed, in between the worlds of journalism and technology for our entire 10-year existence. And I have often been quoted in saying that there is no algorithm for journalism. And I think that our relationship with the tech companies is based on the fact that we are a friend, but we're that sort of annoying friend who keeps telling you, if you're a tech company, that you cannot squeeze the entire realm and purpose of journalism into an A/B, ones and twos, black and white, algorithmically visible solution. Now, having said that, I also don't believe that journalism by itself can solve the issue that a lot of people are now experiencing: content, news, information via social platforms. So it's not good enough to just say, well, just read a newspaper and don't go online. That's simplistic. So our approach has always been, how can journalism make algorithms better? How can algorithms and technology make journalism better? And that's the way we live at Storyful every day. And in particular, I would say, I'm very much in support of the progress that Bill, Adair, and Joel were mentioning in the earlier session, building off claim review, something that already exists, towards media review, creating better methods for tagging and contextualizing image and video content. And that's the key to me. In both worlds, context is king, and something I think that we can move towards and build off all of the things that are already being done by the teams that you're with at Duke and others, are embracing the idea that context is king, and that its labels are important. They're very important for certain things, certain pieces of content, but really what we need to do is find better ways to create signals, not just labels, but signals that drive people towards context and answer that fuller question that people have. Not just, is it real, is it not real, but what do I need to know about this piece of content? So context, to me, is king.
I'm not sure, David, if we should totally give up on the idea of forcing people to watch and read news, but I take your point. So, folks, we're going to talk a little bit more here, but we also want to hear your questions, so please submit those, and we will turn to those in a little bit. Thanks. And then if we can, we'll turn next back to Maarten. And I'd love for you, if you don't mind, to tell us a bit more about how you all went about changing the signals that you were sending on Leadstories, and what that looked like and how it changed, and how you were thinking about it as you made those changes.
Yes, well, at first we realized people are just lazy, and the fewer words they have to read, the better. And they also don't click on links if they see them on social media. So we were realizing our fact checks, if they appeared on social media, they looked a bit like this. So our headline gives the story. We immediately give the conclusion in the headline. So this is a dummy headline. So we're saying, yeah, that video is not real. But we were realizing that, we wanted to make what appears here, we wanted to make it count. So all that space of that image, it's being wasted, and we can put a lot more information in it. And usually the image that we would show was just a screenshot of the false story or of the image. So we experimented with manually adding captions. So this is a very early example from 2016. And then later on, we automated that. So we created some software that I demonstrated during Global Fact 6 that would automatically make those screenshots and add those captions, so that and also our logo, so it would have a more streamlined look and a uniform looking caption. And that the idea was really to stand out in comment sections or in Twitter replies by making the font huge and bright red. But there was one problem when we joined Facebook's third-party fact-checking partnership, and that is that a lot of these thumbnails are used on Facebook are square, so that would cut off a lot of the captions. So recently, we redesigned our whole site, and we took advantage of that to also redesign the look of the labels. So we made them a lot smaller. We toned down the brightness a bit, and we shortened them. So there's only 14 characters maximum. And now they fit inside these square thumbnails as well. And it's entirely up to the author of the fact check to choose what caption to use, as long as it's 14 characters or less. But we ask them to answer the question, why is this piece of content false or misleading or fake or whatever? Not just say fake or false or not true. Why is it fake or false or not true? So in this case, it's because it's old footage. So these aren't really the Hells Angels and the Mongols heading to Seattle to scrap with Antifa. And if you drop the link to our fact check in the comments, you will see our headline that explains that, and also the image of the video, but with old footage superimposed on it. So it explains why that is not footage of the Hells Angels. We also use that short caption as the conclusion in our claim review markup, because just saying false or not true, that's already in the headline. Our headline already explains that it's false or not true or not real. So we take the advantage of that extra field to give some more information and say, why is it not true?
So I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot, Maarten. I'm curious. That's a great explanation of how you got to where you were going. Is this something that you did audience testing with, or is everyday audience testing in your world, and you sort of watch how things play out and make adjustments as you go? People have different approaches. Curious what yours was.
Yeah, we don't really have academics on staff to do audience testing or research. So any offers of help with that, greatly appreciated. But it's also because we felt that our style of images, the old ones, they were too much in your face. When you tell people something they shared online is not real or not true, they feel, in many cases, they feel attacked personally. You're attacking their core belief system, you're attacking their personality or what they stand for. And if you can offer an explanation why it's not true and not real, that softens the blow a bit. At least we
Absolutely.
hope it does.
Yeah, no, I think, in fact, Claire's report, the report that First Draft did with Partnership for AI, really speaks directly to that emotional aspect of all this and how it plays out with people in the real world. Claire, to that end, I wonder if you could walk us through these principles that you all articulated. It's a really spectacular document and very helpful. It pulls together tons of great research and some things that I think are probably intuitive to a lot of fact checkers, but also some things that are probably new or not things that we have time to think about on deadline every day. Whoops. Claire, do we, I'm not sure if we have, I don't know that we have your audio at the moment, so hopefully we can get you back and get you to run through this for us. All right, I guess we may have lost you. We'll come back to you, Claire, because this is important. But let's go on to Sam. Sam, you were starting to talk about harms earlier on, and I wanted to ask you to follow up on that because you had walked us into some of the infrastructure that could help address some of these problems. Tell us more about that, please.
Yeah, I think there's two separate, actually, I would describe them as two separate questions. I think there's a current question of how we really center harm within our fact-checking and our verification work. And how do we really look at what are the tools people need to mitigate harm in closer to real time and at a community level. And certainly at Witness, we draw a lot of inspiration from what people practices around hate speech and dangerous speech. So what is the ways in which labeling can counter dangerous speech and do it at a community level? And I was certainly also very interested to hear in an earlier panel, Eric Mugendi and Gulin from the Turkish fact-checking organization talk about that. And then the second area is this question of there's an increasing movement to think technically about manipulation and authenticity. And it's somewhat driven by the increasing sophistication of audiovisual fakes. So at Witness, we've been focused a lot on how do we prepare better for deepfakes. And this recognizes that the vast majority of content out there are not deepfakes. I am not one of those people who sees a deepfake around every corner. But deepfakes are these new approaches to making it more seamlessly possible to manipulate audio and video. At the moment, they're largely gender-based violence. They're not used around political speech and other things primarily. And one of the things we've seen with deepfakes is it raises two sets of questions. It raises some questions immediately around deepfakes, right? How are you going to talk to people about manipulation that's invisible to the eye, right? So I show you something and it looks completely real, and I'm going to have to explain with some degree of technical competency why it's not what it looks like against all the psychological effects there. And then the second part of it is one of the solution areas to deepfakes that a lot of people are looking at are what we call authenticity infrastructure. And these are initiatives like the Content Authenticity Initiative from Adobe, Twitter, and the New York Times, or the Origin Project from the BBC, that are thinking of ways in which we can better track what is original, how it's manipulated, how it's been changed or edited. So as we know, many videos are circulated with minor changes in context, reattribution, edits. Deepfakes is the most extreme version of that. And there's a lot of work happening now about building this technical infrastructure. And it clearly will be an asset to both fact checkers and verification specialists and people working at a community level. But it has real trade-offs, right? And there's a very prominent set of trade-offs about how you communicate the results of this type of infrastructure, right? How do you communicate to people subtle manipulations, miscontextualizations, when you have the kind of space that Maarten is describing of, you know, a certain number of characters or a caption? How do we enable people to dig down in this to find more information as manipulation gets more sophisticated? And we also have real concerns around who gets included and excluded by these types of tools, right? As they become more de facto, how does that exclude, say, a source that Storyful might go to who is a citizen journalist in Yemen or in Myanmar, or a one-time creator? As you create more and more technical infrastructure for trust that we use to feed into our processes, what are the results of that, both good and bad?
Sam, does it's interesting to hear that there are all these different efforts. To what degree are those efforts being coordinated?
So I would say that there is some overlap between them. So there's clearly a presence of major tech companies in all these efforts, whether it's the same permutation of major tech companies. A significant concern for us is what is the voice of media and civil society and human rights activists, and particularly a global voice, right? Because if you look at the harms, and when I talk about harms in Myanmar or Ukraine or Syria caused by mis and disinformation, at least until recently, the vastly most significant harms from misleading information have happened globally. So I think it's a really key question, not only who are in these groups, right? Is it media and civil society and human rights groups, but is there also a real attempt to think about how these infrastructures will play out globally in places that have already suffered very detrimental effects, both from the platforms, but also previous infrastructure. But I do think it's really important for this community to be engaged more in this space. It's happening more and more. I don't think this community should be complacent about the impact of these infrastructures on their ability to do their work or the pressures on them.
Thanks. And I think we have Claire back with us again. And I know that a big part of your report, Claire, was trying to address some of these same harms that Sam was just describing. And love to call up your the summary slide of your report. But the principles that you outline are all about managing that harm and deciding what needs to be conveyed and sometimes what doesn't need to be conveyed. Can you walk us through that? And hopefully we'll get that up on the screen with you.
Yeah, so the report was actually led by Emily Salt, who's this amazing research fellow who's working with PAI and First Draft. And she was brought on board so that we could do research into labels to see what might resonate with audiences, what wouldn't work. And of course, when you start any research project, you have to do the literature review. And so Emily did this incredible job of pulling together all of this literature and basically saying, well, it seems to me that these 12 principles that come out through the literature. And I think, this particular session is on labels, but I do think we have to think about, there's a number of things that we see happening. So people sometimes talk about kind of notifications. So if a platform tells you that you previously interacted with this versus kind of a flagging system versus a label. And so even, people who know me know that I love definitions, but I think we have to be clear about that. And as we've seen with Twitter, everybody called what Twitter has done to Trump as fact checking. A couple of them have been fact checks, but some of them have been actually kind of flags around incendiary language, which is distinct again from saying, well, this is manipulated media. So as we move into this space, I think we have to think about terminology. But these 12, as you said, Mark, many of them, I think fact checkers are aware of. And there's the one here that actually Maarten talked about, which is using non-confrontational and empathetic language if you can. There's a lot here around ensuring that audiences have to do some work here, because this is a big part of this is actually around digital literacy, of helping audiences understand why something might be false. Like, what are the tactics or techniques that have been used? It's not just good enough to say, well, I'm a fact checker, I'm telling you it's false. How can we use these labels, flags, signals as a way to help audiences understand the process by which the content went through? And that's why the fact checkers made that announcement. So there's that balance between kind of using techniques that help audiences understand why something has been flagged a certain way, which is really important. But at the same time, think about things like the curiosity gaps. Facebook learned to be early on that if you blur an image, audiences go, "Ooh, I wonder what's behind the image. Let me be looking for it." So this is why we have to do so much audience research, because not everything is as we would want it to be. We're all humans. People unfortunately slow down on the motorway when there's a crash. Like, there's a part of that when it comes to graphic imagery and manipulated media that we need to think long and hard about. And the last thing I'd say about why we have to keep testing this is because, Maarten said, I made some changes because I wanted it to be simple. Everybody goes back to the Guardian yellow label that they now add to older content as being a really, really effective flag. Well, what can we learn from that? And how can we be effective, but also simple?
Oops. Oh no, I think we may have lost you, Claire. Hopefully we can get you reconnected again. Well, sorry about that, everybody. And particularly sorry to Claire. We'll connect with you as best we can. We're also just getting some notes from Bybars here that there may be a pretty serious earthquake in Mexico. This is an international conference where we're all on the phone with each other in different parts of the world. So our hearts are going out to everybody who's affected by that. And I know that some of our fact checkers are in Mexico. So hope everybody's doing okay and wishing everybody the best. These disasters often become sort of grounds where misinformation could come out. And in fact, I was just actually texting back and forth with Bybars on this because I was concerned about putting something on YouTube that I hadn't seen actually flash up on my phone from a credible source yet. So, we have to think that way. David, one of the topics that you brought up a few minutes ago was the question of context. And it seems like a lot of fact checking is very focused on the specific, on the thing that just happened or the thing that was just said or the image we happen to be looking at. But I think Angie Holland mentioned in a panel yesterday this idea that it's harder for us as fact checkers to correct bigger narratives, that sometimes these this fake information that's out there kind of drives us off the rails a bit. Are there tools or storytelling techniques that we're missing in our efforts to sort of connect those dots for people? Because that seems like that addresses some of the bigger harms that Sam was talking about.
Well, let me answer that in two different ways, at the two ends of the spectrum, and then harms, I think, is in the middle, affecting both. But looking at one end of the spectrum, content, for instance, there has been an earthquake in Mexico. There should be, and we're looking for tech companies to partner with us to help build this, there should be ways for all of the fact checkers who are now going to start fact-checking information on a breaking news story to know immediately what content of previous earthquakes or plane crashes or what shark attacks or whatever it is already exists, has already been verified or debunked in archives like Storyfuls or APs or Reuters, or a lot of news agencies are now verifying user-generated content, and obviously there's television content as well too, and agency content. That's something that impacts what I think is most important on the content side, which is immediate access to existing information so that you can say, well, that already was debunked, that's old video, here it is, and linking to that. And that's something that I think claim review, media review, an algorithmic tagging approach can help with. There's another thing that can help, and that's speed. Speed of awareness of a fake image or a fake or old or out of context piece of content is really important. The faster that you can tell an audience, this is old, don't touch it, the less likely you are that that thing, and you go back to your original example of the Pelosi video or other high-profile ones recently, speed was a huge factor there. If agencies and others had alerted faster, but more importantly, if tech companies had actually applied their existing terms of service faster, it's not that they didn't have terms of service, if they'd applied them faster, those issues could have been dealt with. On the other end of the spectrum, to address, I think, the meaning of your question, we don't just deal with fact checkers, we're dealing with journalists. We're helping at Storyful, the New York Times, Washington Post, others. There's an amazing new form of journalism, which if you're not aware of it, you haven't been paying attention, which is this digital forensics, visual investigations. Does a video show a helicopter hovering over protesters in Washington? Does a video show somebody kneeling on a black man's neck? I mean, yes is the answer, of course. So it's not just a question of verifying something or saying that something is factual. Context is the key. So I think the real appeal or the real push for the tech companies there is to find better ways of not just letting an audience know that an image or a video is real, but where is it best contextualized? Where has journalism done its job? And obviously that cannot be instant, but it's becoming a lot faster. I mean, we're less than a few weeks into the I Can't Breathe protests, and the amount of fact-checking that has gone on is huge, but the amount of digital forensics is just remarkable, and the incredible graphics and the linking videos and images together. It's fantastic for fact-checkers and visual journalists to have really quick access to archives of old things, verified content that has been verified by professionals, and then to do their job to give you a properly, fully contextualized report. That can happen much faster now than it used to. And I don't think that there's a completely algorithmic way in which tech companies can say, here's context within 10 seconds, but they can certainly do that with content and then create better ways to say, okay, it's a week later, you were interested in that piece of content or that story a week ago. Here's a fully contextualized story that you should pay attention to. And in the middle of that, of course, is the social impact and harm. So for instance, should some eyewitnesses get anonymity? Should people be identified who are shown in videos? Those things need to be taken into account across the entire spectrum. So labeling things on one end, contextualizing on the other end, and awareness of safety and harms issues throughout the entire process. It's not easy, but that's what journalists do. That's what fact checkers do. I think tech companies can help by investing in the right parts of that, and most importantly, getting help, because they certainly are not the experts in this.
Well, Sam, those are all, I know, themes that you're very concerned about too in the work that you do at Witness. What are there questions that you see those of us on the journalism side of things missing, ignoring, routinely messing up the first time around that we should be more careful about and aware of?
Goodness. Let's think what I don't know if it's a question of whether it's messing up. I think there's a general bias, and it's one of the good things that I've seen in the ISCN community towards focusing on the way in which journalism works and the way in which the tech platforms work in the US and Europe, right? And the large critique from many of the groups the Witness works with, and we work with human rights groups and civic journalists around the world, is that we need to decenter the US perspective in order to best understand what we want from the tech platforms. And so, I'll give an example of, how this has played out for us is when we've run a series of expert meetings, bringing together people who have a stake in new problems like deepfakes, like journalists and fact checkers, as well as people who face the brunt of previous waves of misinformation, like civic leaders and political leaders and human rights defenders. And we brought them together in this series of meetings. And one of the meetings that took place in South Africa about 6 months ago, one of the topics we looked at was Twitter's manipulated media policy and the proposal there. And there are elements of that policy that are tremendously interesting and quite powerful, right? And in fact, David's going to some of those. This question of, can we provide context around a piece of manipulation so that people can understand it rather than just be told yes, no, false? And we've seen that Twitter unroll that try that out in the last few months in the US. But the concern we had from many of the people in that meeting was, are the platforms going to resource sufficiently to do this well? Are they going to also provide resourcing to journalistic organizations globally to support them, to do their own forensic investigations of new forms of manipulation? So I think the question is less, are journalists doing it right and wrong, but are we making sure that the solutions that are being proposed at a platform level are ones that are going to work globally, that platforms are going to resource them adequately globally, that they're going to respond to political pressures to do them better or worse globally? And then the other area that comes up for us a lot, and it's definitely an issue that we're concerned about when we start to look at the sort of the scaling of these solutions. And I know we're at this cusp point in the fact-checking community, and I watched the panel on the first day with some of the company representatives of thinking how we scale fact-checking, right? It's and claim review and media review are part of that. And the experience within the human rights community has been seeing as these processes scale, how it excludes and makes discrimination against very legitimate speech and content online. So for those of us who've been tracking, for example, war crimes evidence online, and there are hundreds of thousands of videos that were shared, for example, from Syria, one of the things that has been most disturbing is seeing the repeated ways in which that footage gets taken down by automated processes. And that is far more easily decidable whether that footage is graphic or not than most fact checks and most visual misinformation. That's often, subtle miscontextualization, subtle edits. So I have a real concern, and I think journalists need to critically ask questions as we move towards automation of how that's going to be done right and not going to repeat some of the mistakes in parallel spaces like terrorist and violent extremist content, like the massive takedowns of human rights content. We actually just saw a report coming out from The Intercept, or I think Thomson Reuters Trust did a story showing again how hundreds of thousands of videos have come down off a site known as Syrian Archive, which tracks war crimes evidence. So I think journalists need to ask these skeptical questions and also be aware that feeding into automation processes isn't necessarily a good thing unless we understand how that's going to be done in a way that recognizes the failings of automated processes and the ability to appeal that and actually mitigate harm.
Thank you. I was just gazing down at my phone again because I did get a confirmation on that earthquake report. It sounds like a bad one, 7.4 magnitude. So again, hearts go out to all our friends down that way. We're also still trying to reconnect with Claire, and our friends at Stage 10 are working on that right now. So hopefully we can get back to Claire and talk more about the principles that she outlined in her report. But I also want to start getting to some of our questions from the audience here. First one's for you, Maarten. It comes from Tanu Mitra, who asks, when you put additional info on the image as a hoax alert or not true, do you know in what way it drives your users?
Well, we didn't do any research. We didn't ask them or do any large-scale testing. But from the reactions that we were getting, it's pretty clear. If you look at our inbox, the type of hate mail we sometimes get as fact checkers, if you tell somebody that something they post is not true or it's a hoax, they feel attacked very strongly. So if instead the label says this is a piece of satire, or this is old footage, or something similar that explains why there is something wrong with that link, it's far less confrontational, and it's you're offering additional information instead of saying you are fake news. And that's often the difference between, oh yeah, well, I'll look into that, versus you damn liberal fact checker, I refuse to click on the link, and I hate you, and please go away from Facebook, and I never want to see you again. So that's basically the thinking behind it. And yeah, we don't. I'm sorry, we can't produce any numbers like the percentage reduction in hate mail or anything like that. But if there is any researcher or academic who wants to look into that, feel free to send us an email.
And a related question, I'll toss this one off to David and Sam first, and Maarten, chime in if you have anything to add as well. But Olivia is asking us if there is a design trade-off between using summative labels versus using warnings, per se.
Well, I can address that a little bit, but maybe also just go into the broader response to what Maarten said there, which is that I think that context again is important. Some things, it really is just as simple as saying this is fake or this is old, because that's all anybody needs to know about it, right? It's not worth spending the time and effort to do much more than that. But if you are trying to create a better process for more complicated questions of not just is this fake or old, but why is somebody posting this, or how do you know it's fake or old? My answer to that is that, yes, you need to think very carefully about what the labels are. But to build off what Maarten was saying, I may be an optimist, but I actually think people think that journalism is sexy. And I think they think it is sexy when you show them the process. If you go and say, this is fake and that's it, and you don't tell anybody anything about how you know that, or how you found out, or link them to the original version and show them the forensics that you used to come to that conclusion, well, then they probably will dismiss you as a liberal hack journalist who just wants to annoy them. But if you actually help people understand in a non-aggressive way what it takes, sometimes as few as 2 clicks, to Google reverse image, or to find the way in which that image or video was used previously or in another context, or how it's fake or misleading, you can actually encourage people to think and act in that same way themselves. And certainly at the other end of the process, if you show people the digital forensics that end up happening around protests in Washington and Lafayette Square, or the killing of a black man in Minneapolis, if you ultimately show them all of the forensics and all of the process that's involved, people of all political persuasions are impressed by that process. If they take the time to look at it, which of course you have to encourage them to do. Journalism is about making important things interesting, so it has to be interesting. But if you can get people to look at that and show how cool that process is and how the forensics work, that goes well beyond labels. You can actually create much more progress if you, again, use labels for very simplistic, fake, not fake things, old, not old. But if you can create signals that drive people towards the process, I think that's a better approach.
Sam,
Mark.
I wanted to ask you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to just add something to what David said, which is, and if Claire hasn't had a chance to join us, I wanted to echo one thing that from the 12 PAI principles that Claire was working on, that I think is something we've been seeing a while, and it's come up in a number of projects that are trying to think about multiple layers of information. So, for example, the New York Times Provenance Project that was looking to find out how you surfaced for individuals, different layers of information about date and time and photographer and reuses of an image. And it's been coming up in things like the Content Authenticity Initiative that we've been part of. Is one of the principles that the PAEI team looked at was how do you enable flexible access to layers of information? And I think this goes also to David's observations, right? How do you give people context? How do you enable people to dig down to understand both individual content items, but also potentially broader sort of related media? And the other thing I should say in relation to that is one of the things we heard most clearly as we did this series of expert meetings. We did one in Latin America, one in Southern Africa, and one in Southeast Asia. We were focused a lot on deepfakes, but in fact, as we were talking, we increasingly talked more about sort of shallow fakes, these lightly miscontextualized videos. And one of the clearest asks we saw was, again, a platform ask. And this is not necessarily for fact checkers who know how to do a Google reverse image search or do this kind of reverse search to find a previous video, but is how are we making better accessibility of previous versions of videos, reverse video search available in platforms so that people can do their own discoveries. So again, it's not strictly a labeling question, but it is how do we help people have this process of understanding why we're raising questions about a piece of context and understanding context. And that can come either via this layered UX that is something that's highlighted in the PAI report and has come up in the authenticity infrastructure work, but it's also about making much more easily accessible some of the tools that we all use every day in our work, but are not easily accessible or understood by most average consumers.
Maarten, I've been wondering if there is a need for sort of a universal archive, or if you feel like you've been effectively building that since you started Leadstories. But is there a sort of what would that look like? And how would that be helpful to the overall community of fact checkers in terms of combating this kind of misinformation specifically?
An archive of false content, you mean? Or an archive of fact checks?
Could be either. The media review may bring us part of that, but I'm just curious what's on your wish list.
Well, I think what Google is building with claim review and the overview of fact checks is pretty good. And what the Internet Archive is building with, preserving all these old links, that's great. Maybe if we could add some labels to the Internet Archive, that would also be nice. But I'm not really concerned about fact checks inadvertently spreading false content further or drawing attention to it. At least not ours, because by the time we get interested in fact-checking something, it's usually already pretty viral and there are already dozens of copies floating around the internet. So one more really won't make the difference, and that one copy that we provide can only be seen in the context of a fact-check explaining why it's wrong or why it's false. You do have to be careful with the image popping up in Google image search results, and that's why you should put the conclusion of your fact check in the headline. If you phrase your headline as a question and then that question appears under the unaltered false image in Google image search, then you will get something like, does this image show Barack Obama killing a baby? I don't know, does it? In our case, the headline would be, fact check, this photo does not show Barack Obama killing a baby. And there would probably be a Photoshop sticker over it or label. So that's what you have to be careful about. Make sure that it gets associated with a headline that immediately explains what is wrong with the content.
I think we have Claire back with us now. Claire, are you there?
I hope so. Am I?
It sounds like you are. It's very nice to hear your voice. One thing we may
please
have
nobody
to do
buy a Verizon hotspot. Turns out it's not so good.
Well, I think one thing we may have to do, Claire, is set up an offline Zoom so we can give you equal time that you've lost thanks to bad telecommunications. But thank you for sticking with us and coming back. I wanted to ask you a question early on in this conversation, which is about the audience in general. And if I think about a site like Maarten's, I'm sure Maarten wants everybody on the internet to come read Leadstories every day, but there is only a certain kind of audience that really just is dying to see what the latest thing that's wrong on the internet is. And most people think of this as kind of a utility that you might go to when you're curious if something is wrong, and maybe our efforts to get this mixed into the stream of social media will help. But when I think about the principles that you all have put forward, does the kind of audience that the sort of the clarification or correction is going to, how does that change how we should be thinking about how we present them? A broad audience, national news site, international news site versus something very niche and specific.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Mark, which is even just seeing the growth of global facts over these last 7 years. There are many, many people now that do the kind of work that previously only fact checkers were doing. So I think this, for example, around the coronavirus, we saw Lysol doing a ton of fact checking, and they should have read the 12 principles because they were doing a whole host of things, which was to really emphasize the false information. So actually, these labels matter for many people who have many different audiences. I do think those people who really interact with fact-checking sites like Leadstories, actually, what I would love to see over the next few years is how to build out those audiences as advocates, as people who online can help their friends and family and networks make sense of the information ecosystem. So there is great work by people like Letitia Bode, which is how can you actually do fact checking on a site? Like, how can we expand the types of messengers there are? So I think the people who every day go to Leadstories or Full Fact or PolitiFact, like they really love accuracy and we love them. But what I would love to see is how can we give those people tools to start sharing that information with their networks in a way that's very empathetic, in a way that's non-confrontational, isn't, hey, you're wrong, look what Maarten says. So I'd love to see that as the next iteration, because you're absolutely right, Mark. The audience for different types of sites that are now doing this work are different. And again, that's when we say audiences, what we mean is how do we understand different types of audiences? It is not one monolith thing. And that's what communication research teaches us. And I would love us to get back to those principles to really doing audience research properly.
Well, Tanu sent us a very similar question that's right along those lines, and let me throw that back to Sam and David here, which is how do we get from signals and labels to general digital literacy, which is really what Claire was just addressing. So how do you solve that problem?
I'll go back to what Claire's saying. Is I think we're missing good research on how to embed signals and labels in community-based practice. So in many of the communities where witnesses are involved, you're going to trust a civic activist, a community leader, far more than you're going to trust mainstream media or a professional fact checker. So in what ways are the signals that a platform is providing being used by a civic activist to help share a message? In what ways are the information that may be fact-checked at a national level being used at a community level? One of the things we heard in the series of meetings we did was, a desire to have better signaling, better information at a platform level, but a real desire to then contextualize media literacy at a local level. And that's, I think, been one of the lessons from media literacy work is it has to be contextual, it has to be local. So, for example, in the Brazil-based work we did, which was included a meeting that brought together favela-based activists, looking at favela-based influencers who might be media makers, but might also be other types of influencers. How do you support them to facilitate community conversations around this? And then at a macro level, what is the role of a Facebook or a YouTube or a WhatsApp in providing a layer that supports that?
And I would echo that. I think that something that we can all do is spread the religion that friends don't let friends share misinformation. And I think specifically, and we've worked with the News Literacy Project on this, and there are other projects, and MediaWise is a great project as well too. I am a huge optimist when it comes to the next generation. A lot of people think that because we're mired in misinformation now, that the next generation will be afflicted by that. And they could be. But when I look at what teenagers are talking about, younger people are talking about, even on some of the craziest platforms like TikTok and elsewhere, I have reason for optimism that young people think that it is cool to check things before you share them, and that it is cool to understand how journalism and fact-checking work, and anything and everything that we can do to support that. And as Sam said, that the tech companies can do to support that. I think the pieces are in place, but they could certainly be invested in more, and they could certainly be spread more by all of us and by news organizations and tech companies.
That's
Maarten,
something we also try to do. We have this little widget at the end of each article, which is nothing more but a link to a search on Twitter for the headline of the false story. And we encourage people to share our link with our fact check as a reply to these false headlines. And yeah, we literally use our readers to help spread the fact check, and it works. We regularly see that some person will share our link 10 times in a row, replying to 10 different tweets that all repeat a false claim. So people really want to help out and spread corrections and spread fact checks if you just make it easy for them.
Well, Claire, one of your 12th principle is adapt and measure labels according to the use case. And we were just talking a moment ago about the lack of research and what would make this effective and mobilize that community of users who could share these corrections with people. What kind of research would you like to see done, and who do you think should be doing it?
So, I mean, we have some great natural experiments going on right now. And of course, the Twitter labels is an example of that. They're already sitting on data to say, well, how many people clicked on that blue exclamation mark? When they went to the Twitter moment, what did they do? Did they reshare that with their friends and say, isn't this interesting? Did they reshare it with their friends with a poop emoji? We don't really know. And so, I mean, I have said this to Twitter, which is it's in their interest to have independent auditing of the effectiveness of this experiment, essentially. So that in 6 months' time, they can either say, well, actually, you'll be very surprised to see that this actually really decreased the amount of shares on those particular tweets. Or, well, we tried it for 6 months, but what we found was it actually became a kind of a bullseye and more people started talking about that content. So, I mean, Maarten has said, you know, if you're a researcher, reach out. You know, I know I say this at every conference, but we have to find a way to embed researchers with platforms. And we have to find ways to do research more quickly and to write it up in a way that's really accessible, because, you know, Emily did an amazing job with that report, but that's built on the back of amazing academics who have done incredible work over the last 10 years. But it's all kind of locked up in lots of different journals that not many of us can access. And even if we can we read it all full 8,000 words and make sense of it? Maybe not. And so if you are a fact checker or a platform UX product manager, do you know how, you know, maybe Brendan Nyhan's work or Random Petticook's work applies to what you're doing today? So that's the dream, which is we're in this moment of we need to move much more quickly. So, you know, some of you might have seen yesterday new research out about the Facebook's 10 top tips to spot false news. That was April 2017, and we've just got the research. We cannot wait another 3 years to tell us whether or not Twitter's manipulated label works. We just cannot. And so it's great research, glad it exists, but goodness me, like that should have been a 6-month turnaround. So, I mean, that's what I'm talking about, which is we don't know, you know, maybe those 10 top tips didn't have the impact. And it's great research, but it's still not based on Facebook's data. The researchers had to recreate and run a survey based on it. Like, we are losing this battle. And I couldn't be more passionate about this, as you can tell.
Well, and that's why we desperately needed you on this call, Claire, and I'm glad you made it back to give a big finish for us. Thank you. And maybe we can figure out some offline way that more people can talk to you and hear more about this this excellent report that you all did. I want to thank you, Claire, and David, and Sam, and Maarten for your time and efforts to prepare for this particular panel. And sorry for the technical difficulties. Kind of weird to have breaking news happen while we're talking. And I also wanted to thank our friends at Stage 10 who've both helped us get ready for this and troubleshoot it as we go. Quite a team there too. So thanks everybody. We'll see all of you at the next panel, and enjoy the rest of Global Fact 7.